Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Helen Toner, and I am Director of Strategy and Foundational Research Grants here at CSET, the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University. Today, we are here to dive into some very exciting work that has been happening at a nonprofit called OpenMined, which builds open source, privacy-enhancing software and works directly with major tech companies and other organizations to implement their tools. In a moment, I'll bring our experts on screen and say a little more about what we'll be discussing today. But first, let me share a couple of logistical points. First, all attendees' microphones are muted. If you're on a computer and experience any technical issues, then use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to let us know, and a CSET team member will do their best to help you out. And second, we'll be starting with around 20 minutes of presentation from Andrew and Irina, and then we'll be opening up into a discussion. So we want to have an engaging dialogue with everyone listening. So as questions come to mind during the presentation, please begin sharing them in the chat, questions and comments, and we will do our best to cover as many of those as we can once we get to the Q&A portion. With that, let me introduce our panelists. We have Andrew Trask joining us. He is the founder and executive director of OpenMined and also has several other quite impressive hats that he wears at different times. He's a PhD candidate at Oxford, a term member at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a senior research scientist at Google DeepMind, a founding member of the UN's Privacy Enhancing Technology Lab, and he's also the author of 3 AI courses and an Intro to AI textbook, each of which has served more than 10,000 students. So he's making us all feel a little lazy. We're also joined by Irina Bejan, who is a technical product manager at OpenMined. So Irina leads the kind of pilots that we're going to talk about today, pilot projects, which demonstrate how institutions, companies, and researchers can collaborate to govern and utilize non-public sensitive data. Irina has a master's degree in machine learning from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, Lausanne, and she has held engineering and research roles at Google, as well as leading nonprofit initiatives to empower student founders at Founderful and bridge the gender gap in technology through her work with Girls Who Code. So also making us all feel like slouches, but very excited to talk to the two of you today. Thank you so much for joining us. So before handing the floor to you, I just wanted to sort of set a little context for our audience today. So my program at CSET has provided grant funding to support OpenMind's work. And I'm really excited to be able to host you for this discussion today to talk about some of what you've been working on, some, as part of the project that we've funded, and some work that you've done before that as well. So you're about to dive into how OpenMind's tools work and some of the concrete projects you've been working on. But I thought I'd say a little about why this work is so relevant from a policy perspective. The short version is that, or how I see it is that, I think in AI policy, it can be easy to get lost in all of these different problems that can seem totally separate from each other. But what OpenMined is working on is really this kind of cross-cutting infrastructure that can make it possible to use and analyze private data, private models, other private assets in ways that may not, people who aren't familiar with privacy-enhancing technologies may not realize are possible. And so as AI systems of different kinds become more impactful in all of our lives, whether that's recommender systems on social media or large language models that are now being used by hundreds of millions of people. One of several things that your tools make possible is enabling more external scrutiny of those models and other kind of private data and other things associated with them, making scrutiny by external actors much more possible while still protecting privacy, security, IP, and all of that. So I'm very excited to hear more. Also very excited that today you're going to tell us about some of the concrete projects that you've been working on with some pretty major companies in this space. And if I understand right, we're also going to hear some about some new projects and new success stories that haven't yet been told publicly anywhere else. So everyone on this webinar is in for a treat as far as I'm concerned. With that, I will turn the floor over to you, Andrew and Irina, and you can share your slides and we can get started. Again, we should do something like 20-25 minutes, I think, of this initial presentation, and then we'll kick over into Q&A portion. So please feel free to start putting questions in the chat.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Helen. Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much to Helen and the CSET team and the FRG program for all the support. Like Helen said, so my name is OpenMined, or sorry, my name is Andrew, and I'm with OpenMined, and this is Irina. Yeah, we're going to talk about some of the work we've been doing recently. So OpenMined is a nonprofit that builds open source technology which helps address privacy, security, and IP challenges when researching on sensitive data. And as Helen just mentioned, AIs obviously have a pretty big influence in the world these days. And for a moment, we're going to talk about one specific area of that, which is that they influence how people spend their time. Just to give some numbers to that, there's around 8 billion people in the world, and we're awake for about 124 billion hours a day collectively. About 1 billion of those hours are on YouTube, 2 billion on YouTube and Instagram, throw in TikTok, and that's about 3.5 billion. If you consider the top, social media platforms, the ones that are AI driven, this is around 12 billion hours a day out of the 124 billion hours that we are awake, which is roughly 90 minutes per person, or almost 10% of the amount of time that people spend awake around the world is consuming content that is affected by, or guided by an AI algorithm of one kind or another. And that's why lots of conversations surface around this. People ask about child safety, people ask about disinformation or national security or political polarization, because these things have such a significant impact on our lives around the world. And what some people have observed is that some folks are getting hurt, right? That there's evidence to indicate that there might be some problems going on here. And so a lot of people are asking, how do we measure these types of harms, and how can we ultimately avert them? And there's a lot of groups that are asking this question. So, lawmakers are asking, industry leaders are asking, researchers and think tanks are asking, a variety of AI platforms, stand-up teams do this type of thing. Whistleblowers are asking, citizens are asking, as a shot from last year. And then, of course, world leaders and across the global stage are inquiring about these types of problems. And to zoom in on what these types of questions are like, we wanted to look at a specific example of sort of AI-related and AI-driven harms that we walk through, where we started to see and apply some of the technology that we were talking about in this project. So in 2019, unfortunately, in Christchurch, New Zealand, there was a terrorist attack, and just under 50 people were killed, and about the same number were seriously injured. And after the investigation of this attack proceeded, people started to notice that there was a social media and an algorithmic link, in particular, that the radicalization process engaged with content that was ranked by AI algorithms in terms of consuming terrorist and violent extremist content online. And naturally, the Prime Minister of New Zealand asked, why did this happen, and what can we do to prevent this from happening in the future? And so Prime Minister Ardern and President Macron, convened a new group called the Christchurch Call, which has grown to include a lot of governments and online service providers. And I'm going to feature those governments and online service providers and also civil society groups. And that created an interesting dialogue that really highlights the type of problem that we're going to be talking about here in terms of infrastructure. Right. So in 2019, they would kind of meet on an annual or semi-annual basis. And amidst many topics they talked about, they would ask, can independent researchers study the TVEC problem on your platform, the spread of terrorist and violent extremist content online? And of course, the online platforms know this is a really important issue and want to be able to help, but they also have legitimate privacy, security, and IP concerns about, people accessing, things like user logs and models and all these types of things. And this conversation continued. So, in later conversations, so in 2020, similar questions were raised. In the meetings in 2021, similar questions were raised. And as time went on, these questions got more detailed, right? So, for example, civil society groups might ask, can you open source your data? Can various aspects of your data sets, or sometimes AI models can be open source, these types of things. But for a lot of platforms, there are too many privacy, security, and IP concerns to being able to release this type of open data, especially things like user logs and this kind of thing. Civil society and governments might ask, can these independent researchers come on site, right? And then we get into questions about how many, and there's quite a few projects, and there's a lot of things to ultimately study, and these are quite difficult. And so sometimes the logistics and overhead of people coming on site and doing, flying to California or Paris or wherever it might be, and a researcher staying there for weeks or months on end to ultimately work with platform data can be very difficult. And often the platforms will offer API access. They'll offer to especially if they have a consumer-facing app or something like that. and civil society researchers or other independent researchers will ask, well, can it support this project or that project or another project? But then this creates artificial constraints that can always be solved by an API, but it ends up requiring new development and new engineering on a per project basis, which is not particularly scalable. And so in 2022, we met Jacinda Ardern's team and ultimately expressed optimism that there was a new type of infrastructure that could help rectify this tension and facilitate safe, privacy-preserving, secure, IP-protecting access to answer important questions. And so based on this optimism, President Macron and Prime Minister Ardern, at the press release at the UN General Assembly in 2022, announced this new project with OpenMined, and 3 platforms stepped forward to try it out. And this was X, at the time Twitter, Dailymotion, and LinkedIn, which is owned by Microsoft. And so with that, and following that, the United States, New Zealand, and CSET generously provided funding to help this project move forward. And X, Dailymotion, LinkedIn provided funding as well as access to their production systems to be able to and the teams of people that ultimately steward those systems to help test this new hypothesis. So the next thing that happened was we created a technical plan, right? And the goal here is for an external researcher to be able to access and extract answers to very specific questions at platforms like LinkedIn without seeing the underlying data, without having to come on site, if that makes sense. For this, we're going to use an open source software platform called PySIF. So everything I'm going to show you is freely available open source software. We're a nonprofit, funded by institutions like CSET to make freely available public infrastructure. And that's sort of our nonprofit mission. So let me show you how it works. So the key technology is called a data site. It's like a website, but for data. And LinkedIn deployed one of these data sites. And what happened next was an administrator uploaded their private information into their own data site. So again, controlled by them on their infrastructure. They created an account for an external researcher, and then they go away and have a coffee, right? And let the server steward access to this type of information. Then an external researcher shows up. They log in using their username and password. They can submit their research code that specifies the specific question they're trying to answer, right? And there's a process by which we can do this that actually involves not seeing the underlying data, which Irina will show you in a moment. This is the privacy enhancing technology part. And then once those answers exist in the data site, but they haven't been downloaded yet, the Microsoft administrator is able to review the project. And if the project is approved, the external researcher downloads their answers and goes on their merry way. So across this project, we repeated this process at a number of different locations, right? And what we want to tell you about today is what that experience was like. So specifically with Microsoft and Dailymotion, it was like this. We would have regular online virtual calls with the team at Microsoft and Dailymotion. And over the course of a year, these servers got deployed, data was loaded in, and then researchers. Here we have one of those researchers, Chihao Chen, who was able to obtain access, submit a research project that facilitated the answering of specific questions without seeing the underlying data. And what we're really talking about here is a broader context, a new type of infrastructure through which researchers around the world can propose arbitrary questions against relatively arbitrary. By arbitrary, I mean very, very flexible, meaning they can submit what software developers will call arbitrary code, right? For any particular research question they're interested in, and platforms can triage those types of projects coming in and approve questions that that conform to their access policies. And this allows us to answer, lots of specific questions without having to see the underlying data, without triggering these kind of privacy, security, and intellectual property concerns. Oh, and now Irina is going to show you with even more detail what this specific project looked like. Take it away, Irina.
Here you go. So now we're going to talk about the research goal, and I'm going to show you a demonstration of how that actually went for us. And we're going to focus on Dailymotion, which is, as you see here in the screenshot, a video streaming company. So we're going to talk super briefly about what it means to study an AI recommender system, and then do an exercise of that. So firstly, it's as simple as like every time Dailymotion shows you a video, it adds up to the number of impressions of that video. And impression data is super important because it allows us to understand if there's any algorithm amplification of specific type and why it could occur. So this is an example schema that Dailymotion proposed. And in this, you can see like a lot of like video metadata, the number of times it was recommended, and how harmful it was rated. So now let's go to the exercise, which goes to the step that Andrew outlined, like launch a data set, submit a research question, review, approve, and then get the answers. So the first step, as we flagged, is that the Dailymotion admin would basically launch this data site and load the impression data into the data site. A thing to flag again is the researcher never works directly with the private data, but a fake version that mimics the private one. And this is very important because bulk data can be distributed openly to anyone, and researchers can use it to propose and test their research code. So let's move it step by step. I connect to the server itself. Oh, it's going to jump a little bit sometimes. Oops. Just give me a second. There might have been some state. Sorry for that.
And just to give some commentary for the audience watching at home, what's happening here is that you're running this code live to actually get the answers live. And so you're just sorting out something
Like
was
oh, there we go. Cool.
not quite right. But here we go. But the reason this is cool is that you're not just doing something pre-canned, you're actually doing it in real time.
Yes, thank you, Helen. So let's get back into it. So now I have access to the data side. I load from file the private and the mock data that was generated a priori. And now I can basically create my data set, upload it to the client itself. So now it's going to be available on the server. The next step I'm going to do is that I'm going to create an account for the external researcher, just a pair of credentials. And now that it's there, I can go grab a coffee and let the researcher do their magic. So now moving onto this right part of the screen, I'm gonna have the researcher notebook and go through the steps that they would go through. So in the first place, they would connect to the data site itself using the credentials that were generated for them, and then they will try to submit their research question. The first step into that is to basically understand what data is available. So running through this now, you're going to see like what is the data set, what the mock data looks like, and then you can formulate your research question. And in this case, like is harmful content amplified by Dailymotion's algorithms? And I'm going to propose my project with this purpose and submit it. And now the second part is like proposing the research code. And I must be careful that the research code I'm proposing is aligned with the data usage and release policies of the companies whose assets I'm analyzing. So here is just like a brief example where you write just your Python code, and then with the decorator, it's ready to be submitted to the server. I'm going to skip the details in the interest of time. You can test it locally against the mock data itself, so you can see like how it actually looks and that it works, and then you can submit it to the data owner for review. Now let's move to the left side, take the data owner hat, and now we can see the project that I have received, read about it, read the code itself to see what it actually entails. And if it aligns with like what I'm comfortable approving, then I can approve it. And going back on the left side again, I can then basically just simply fetch the final answer. And that's pretty much it. So now back to Andrew to tell you more about other type of pilots we've done.
Brilliant. Thank you. All right. So what we envision for this infrastructure is that these types of servers that allow researchers to download, a fake or mock version of private assets, propose code against them, and upload that code for review and execution. We envision this being a part of a broader set of infrastructure where a wide variety of different institutions can deploy this type of infrastructure and allow researchers generically to ask and answer sort of new and novel questions over a long sustained period of time. But those don't just have to be ones about sort of social media, terrorist and violent extremist content, as in the Christchurch call. They can also be, things about disinformation. So if you wanted to ask the question, are AIs used to generate fake news or polarization? Does a various AI algorithm amplify the political conversation that's going on various platforms, or even child safety? Is AI, pushing or coercing children into dangerous actions? there's nothing about this infrastructure that is particularly narrow. And indeed, the whole vision and point of this infrastructure is that it's a new means by which external researchers can propose projects to be run against private platforms without having to have the constraints of a fixed created API or the logistics of having to come on site. And our hope is that, zooming out over the coming years, is that we'll see lots of these servers deployed in lots of different places, and that would really grease the wheels on the transparency conversation, while also ensuring that we preserve privacy, security, and intellectual property during that process. But there's another problem. For those who might be looking closely, there's a big issue here that we haven't addressed, and that some new projects and new infrastructure is jumping into. Now, this is a little bit more complicated, so I'd like to give a little bit of grace to do kind of the cartoon version of this first, and then we'll get into some detail here on the call, and then we'll have lots of time for questions and digging into specific subtopics. So I want to talk about an important use case that has been increasingly in the discourse over the last couple of years, which is biorisk. So, can an AI model be used to create a bioweapon? And this is an important question that researchers want to be able to ask of say, places that are hosting large language models and these types of things. But if a researcher is to ask this, then the next natural question is, well, what does a bioweapon look like? Do you have an example that we can run through, say, a large language model and see if that large language model would be likely to generate a file of that type, right? But researchers then have a problem, which is, possessing a file or instruction manual or a description of this type can often be quite illegal. And so it's very rare that people will have this type of data, but we also need to check for this type of data. So, there's a fundamental tension here. Now, if a researcher was getting very creative, they would realize, oh, well, there are some people who are allowed to have this type of data, such as a government agency, right? Who are responsible for cataloging, defending against these types of threats on society. And the next natural question is researchers in AI labs would say is like, well, can we use that for an evaluation? Right? Can we access the file to be able to do this important work? And unfortunately, a government agency can't necessarily reveal that type of information, right? So neither party wants to share their private assets, but both assets need to be on the same computer in order to be able to be used for an evaluation. Right. So in this case, the government agency has a responsibility to ensure that this type of information is not generally available, and there are laws and restrictions that mean that they have to maintain control over the copies that they have in classified environments. Meanwhile, AI labs around the world, not even just domestically in any particular country, want and need to hang on to their intellectual property, right? And so this is a sort of a two-way desire. In other words, they need some type of mutual secrecy, right? Some sort of structured way to be able to facilitate this. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a high-level description of a recent pilot that we accomplished between Anthropic and the UK AI Safety Institute. This was an exercise, so we did it with two public assets. So one was GPT-2, and the other was the Camel Bio dataset, which is a biology-related dataset, to start to kick the tires on how this process could work in the future. So again, this is not, let's say, a full production system, but an initial pilot, thanks to support from CSET. And partners. So what I'm going to talk about here is the rough process that this goes through, and we can talk about more in the Q&A if there are questions. So first, instead of having just one organization launch a data site, multiple organizations launch a data site. So in this case, Anthropic and AC. And each of this happens on infrastructure they control. And in a normal circumstance, what they would look for is a trusted third party, some sort of third computer that they can both trust to be able to perform this computation together. They could use both of their secret assets as kind of an escrow, as it were, to perform this evaluation. And the challenge, in a wide variety of contexts, is that this trusted third party is really, really hard to find. There could be laws that prevent things from crossing international borders, that prevent things from going from the private sector to the public sector, or the public sector doesn't want to release it into a different jurisdiction, different legal jurisdiction. And so what we piloted here and we tested here is the use of what's called a GPU enclave. So an enclave is a special computer chip that has properties that make it a very ideal trusted third party, meaning you can encrypt information that can only be decrypted once it actually gets into the chip itself. And the chip, keeps everything encrypted when it writes to RAM and a variety of other properties we can talk about if there's time. So just to give you a general sense on how it works, and we can talk more about it in a moment, instead of a researcher submitting their project just to one organization, as Irina showed just a moment ago, that researcher would submit their project to 2 organizations, right? They would submit their project to both Anthropic and to AC in this particular case, right? And then they would review that project themselves and decide whether they want to participate in this information flow, if that makes sense. If what's going to be revealed to the researcher or to anyone else in this joint computation is acceptable from a privacy, security, intellectual property perspective. And if it's approved, then what they do is they spin up this type of data site with a GPU enclave. And what that GPU enclave produces is a very special type of certificate. And that certificate basically inspires AC and Anthropic to believe that the enclave is only going to run the computation that was approved, meaning the specific code that they have approved is the only thing that this chip is going to be allowed to compute. And after that, sort of all the RAM and program will be erased, if that makes sense. So with that attestation in hand, they can send their model and data set into this GPU enclave data site, which can produce the result for the researcher, and which can be downloaded and the original assets erased. And to show you a quick peek at how that process works, I'll hand it back to Irina.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me just take the screen sharing. So there we go again. Similar process. I think you can all see it. Let me just start my video as well. Okay, so now we're going to look at the demo, which is basically focused on like how can you achieve mutual secrecy using PySift. And we're going to run some example of how you can achieve this, inspired by the pilot we did with Anthropic and the UK AI Safety Institute. So the first question is like, how can you study foundational AI models? And then when I'll run through an exercise to like showcase how that works. So let's say a frontier AI model developed a new model. In our case today, it's going to be GPT-2 for simplicity. And to study it, researchers would like the ability to, for example, interact directly with the model, to prompt it directly, interpret its internals, like reverse engineer the model, or like study how it has been used at scale by people via its user logs. While this is possible in our current paradigm, we're going to showcase the simplest, the first one. Then we have a government agency that's hosting confidential data about bioweapons. Today, this is a public chemistry data, and it is structured as a set of questions that check if the model has that knowledge. Right, so let's jump into it. The first step, as before, is launching the data sites, and basically each of the admins need to upload their data. The iLab is the first one. Actually, I'm going to keep running through it just for like more time for questions. But going through it, they load the private and mock model from file. They upload it the same paradigm as we've seen with data. And then once it's uploaded to the data side, it's the turn for the government agency to load their data as well. So the same process, they connect to it, they can load their file. And you can see here very concrete examples of the private versus the mock. So the private has very concrete questions and probably very confidential sensitive, but the mock data is just like some gibberish text that matches a little bit what the private data looks like. So now it can be uploaded to the data site, and once that is basically made available, now it's the turn for both admins to create an account for the external researcher. So that is happening here, and now they can both go grab a coffee because they have done their work to set up their servers. Now, looking on the right side, the researcher's notebook, they want to submit a research question. So what they will do, they will use the credentials that they have received to connect to both data sites, and then they will start understanding what data and models are available. So they're going to see the GPT-2 model. They can look at the model code to understand how they can use it, the public model code, right? And then they can also like inspect the data set, and then using this information, they can now basically formulate a research question, which in this case is like, can the AI Labs model disseminate information for building bioweapons? They submit their project similarly as we've seen before, but before proposing the research code, we need an enclave. So you can spin up one yourself, or you can look if any of the data sites is basically connected to an enclave. And here we can see one, we use that one, and now it's time for us to write our code. The code is quite simple, it's right here, but what you see on top is basically a series of input, output, and runtime policies, which is the way in PySIF to state exactly how the code should be run, what assets should be used, and basically have guarantees on what actually happened inside the enclave. And then you submit this request, and then again, you go grab a coffee. Everyone is grabbing a coffee today. Now let's move to the left side on the data owners, which they would like to verify the code in the enclave. So the first step is for both of them to independently review the submission to see if it aligns with their, like, again, data exchange-based policies of their companies. So they look at the project, they can read what events happened within that project, they can read the code itself, policies, everything that's attached to it. And let's say it was good. So the next step is to basically independently check the enclave integrity, which makes sure that the enclave hardware and the running software like the eval code, PySIF, etc., are the ones that were expected. So they can request basically this type of attestation. It's a lengthy report, which basically this is a summarized part, which shows like the most important things. And then you get a checkbox, depending on like the CPU and the GPU level. And then you can as well like approve request from each admin side. Once this happens, we can move back to the researcher hat. We just sync the project. It's a distributed project, so it needs to be synced. Then we can see that the response was received from the two admins. So we can initiate the asset transfer. The assets are moved into the enclave, and then we kickstart the execution. And the output of the execution is a verifiable output, which basically shows everything that went in, what actually happened, and with its proper cryptographic guarantees. So then you can, at the end, just fetch the results and you're done. So switching back to Andrew.
Thank you very much. So what we're envisioning here is that a wide variety of organizations can deploy and in fact have already deployed this type of infrastructure. So you see a variety of the pilots they've been working on recently. So the U.S. Census Bureau at Microsoft, Reddit, Luther, United Nations, eStat, Statistics Canada, et cetera, that are testing or evaluating, and in some cases putting in production data already. So different organizations are at different levels of evaluating this type of infrastructure. But that if organizations like this were to come together, what this can enable is researchers to extract just the specific answers to specific questions, where the only thing they see, ideally, is the mock data and the fake versions of things that they can download, as well as the answers to the specific questions that they pose. And that they could do so not just for data that's located at one organization, but if they needed to use data from multiple organizations, that same principle could still be possible, that they can download the answer to a specific question without having to see the underlying data that's distributed across many different organizations. And to give it a sense of how general that problem and that solution could be, online platforms, it's not just limited to biorisk related harm. So if you think about if you're trying to evaluate whether an AI model is biased based on various demographic information, often an online platform won't have ground truth demographic information, but a place like a Census Bureau or IBGE or these types of organizations do professionally collect and steward and protect that type of demographic information. And so this problem of mutual secrecy between multiple different organizations and preserving intellectual property and privacy and security, and also a sense of like healthy governance over this type of information, that we don't need to put all this information into one party that then would be trusted with controlling that information, but that ultimately control over how this type of infrastructure could facilitate answering important questions can remain distributed over many different organizations who are already responsible for stewarding that type of information. So we think that this is both a means of answering important questions in society while also sort of upholding lots of important democratic values and these types of things. So yeah, our big hope is that this can kind of catalyze a new sort of type of internet that can access non-public information and extract specific answers. We're very, very grateful to CSET for all their support and would love to answer any questions that you have about the projects that we've been working on.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrew. You can probably drop the screen share. Perfect. And we can switch into Q&A. I have a ton of questions, so I'm hoping that no one in the audience asks any, so I can just ask mine. I'm kidding. Please pop your questions into the chat, and we will get to as many of them as we can. And to give folks a little bit of time to enter those, we have some great ones coming in already, but I'm going to use my moderator's privilege to ask a few just to get us kicked off. To start with, I mean, I think something that, so we've been talking, Andrew, about the technologies that you're working on for a few years at this point, and something that I find both really exciting and also sometimes a little bit mind-boggling about them is, how flexible they can be and what a wide range of different, problems that that they can potentially tackle. So today, you really focus on these 2 pilot projects to sort of give us a concrete sense of a couple of the examples. But I would love to just expand the aperture a tiny bit. So if we talk about, for example, that you tell me if I'm understanding this right, the setup that you used for LinkedIn and Dailymotion, what you're doing there was the use of this data site meant that external folks could run analysis on private data, private user data that was difficult to share, but let them answer questions about that user data. If I'm understanding right, that setup can be flexible and let external researchers, answer questions about lots of kinds of data. So for example, do you want to talk through how that might be used to look at, the training data that's used for an AI system or something like that? Or if there's a different application that you think is also exciting, just to sort of get a sense of, some of the flexibility here?
Yeah, sure. So generally speaking, there are like 3 categories of access that most people around AI systems are interested in. So it's usually either training data or the model itself, or sometimes like the architecture around the model. So like things like input or output filters or these types of things, or the user logs. So it's kind of like, inputs the model itself and then what the model outputs. I would say folks who are interested in analyzing after the fact, whether models are impacting people in the real world, tend to focus on user logs. People who are focusing on hypothetical capabilities that might be in the future tend to focus on the model itself and on various filters on it and this kind of thing. And then for a wide variety of different reasons, some people focus on the training data. And the reason that the data site paradigm is so flexible is because you can create a fake or mock or imitation version of all these things. Researchers can download that fake or mock or imitation version of it, meaning like, if there's a user log that has 20 million rows of data that has 5 columns and this kind of stuff, people can download a pretend version of that big data set with the same columns and generally the same schema, and they can write their code against that. And you can do the same thing for models, and you can do the same thing for training data, which is why, if we look at our work with Reddit or our work with LinkedIn or our work with Dailymotion, this kind of same paradigm works across them, and the enclave paradigm also works as well, where you can download fake or mock assets from multiple places locally, do your computation, and figure out how you want to join these up and what types of outputs you want and all this kind of stuff, and then submit them. So yeah, and maybe one other point of skepticism we usually get is like, well, how do I do good data science if I can't physically see the data? And it turns out that people are already pretty used to working with data that is too big for them to be able to read, if that makes sense. And so they have lots of ways of querying into it to get samples or whatever the case might be. All of that generalizes to this paradigm. Like the stuff when it's too big for you to be able to see it, think about the same tools being when it's too private for you to be able to see all of it, right? If that makes sense.
So you can still do like exploratory data analysis and get the shape of the data and the frequency
exactly.
of
And it might be like a little bit slower because there's someone on their side who's actively protecting their IP and this kind of stuff. But in practice, it ends up feeling more familiar than people expect for that reason.
Great. Okay. A couple more from me. What we've talked about and a lot of what you've been working on the last couple of years has been, really pilot projects kind of getting the underlying sort of technical advances here are not super new, is my understanding, but getting the infrastructure in place, both the technical, just engineering, coding everything, getting it all inside the right organizations, and also from a kind of governance or policy perspective or, legal perspective, when you have an actual company or an actual, Census Bureau making decisions, they have lawyers, they have priorities, they have processes. So I'd love to hear, as you've worked through these pilot projects, what are either on the technical side or on kind of the governance side, some key lessons that you think you've learned, either, problems you've had to solve or things that turned out to be easier than you thought or harder than you thought. What kind of stands out? I imagine there's too many to go through them, but would be interested in any highlights.
Yeah. So I think there's kind of 2 highlights for 2 different communities. So for the technologists, you're right. The low-level algorithms and infrastructure we're talking about here is not new stuff, right? This is, a lot of this has already been deployed at scale in very narrow contexts. So think, stuff like federated learning or differential privacy, which was a big part of the LinkedIn Dailymotion projects. You're probably running it on your phone or on your laptop right now if you're using a modern operating system. the challenge that technologists have faced historically is that these are like individual puzzle pieces that kind of each solve a part of the privacy problem, but don't solve all of it. And there's been a bit of a challenge for the technical community to really try to embrace this notion of like, hey, these need to be integrated together into kind of end-to-end infrastructure that just kind of gets out of your way and just lets you access data and do things. So I think that's been a real learning lesson for us in terms of as technologists and kind of coming to grips with that as a more of an integration science than necessarily building up new individual components. For the platforms, the biggest barrier is usually education. And I would say there's two big headwinds that tend to come up. One, they've already encountered privacy enhancing technologists before. And the most common paradigm there is where a privacy enhancing technologist will recommend like one pet, like synthetic data is all you need, or homomorphic encryption is all you need, or federated learning is all you need, this kind of thing. And they got a little bit of a bad taste in their mouths because it turned out it maybe wasn't all that they needed. And then the other surprising thing is that privacy enhancing technologies, for the most part, don't actually exist to make access possible when it wasn't possible before. They exist to lower the logistics costs for the organization that is facilitating that access. Because people can come on site, you can sit them down with one of your internal employees who looks over their shoulder as they're doing analysis. Like all this stuff can be facilitated. It's just really, really expensive. And the idea of privacy enhanced technologies is having people not have to travel to your building. You don't have to run a secure facility. You don't have to have internal computers that are locked down in these particular ways. You don't have to have as big of a team that's triaging these different projects and all this kind of stuff.
Don't have to sign NDAs necessarily.
Exactly. Yeah. Reduce legal costs. So in a lot of these projects, the previous version of the program, they had super heavy legal requirements. And in some of our projects, we've had with very, very serious companies, the external researchers, even in international context, didn't have to sign any NDAs because they weren't ever seeing anything except for the results of their specific queries, if that makes sense. And so the kind of time to market, the reduction in cost and risk is really what pets are all about. And I think that's usually the education piece that's missing when we first meet an online platform that's learning about this for the first time.
Yeah, great. Okay, I have more, but there's a ton of good questions coming in the chat, so I will switch over to some audience questions, and I'll kind of bunch a few because there's people asking about similar themes. So one thing I think people would love to hear more about is this process of the data owner kind of approving projects. So does that take a long time? Does it add a big delay? How does it affect kind of the power dynamics at play here? Meaning, if they can just veto a question, doesn't that kind of sort of defeat the point? Or can you talk a little bit about what that review process looks like?
Yeah. So one thing that's worth mentioning is the review process kind of takes two clusters. One is we're doing this for the first time review process. And then there's we kind of got used to this. We see how it's going on review process. We're doing it for the first time usually has lots of extra hurdles that have the online platform doing things relatively manually that pets, privacy enhanced technologies can provide even more automation for. But they kind of don't want to like jump in with both feet all on the first day. They want to get started and like do some things by hand and realize, oh, I'm making the same decision over and over again. I can use a pet to automate this in the future. So just with that disclaimer, let's focus on probably that most manual version of it, because I think that's probably the center of your question. And that's usually the barrier that actually prevents platforms from trying this kind of stuff out. So for that kind of thing, the researcher needs to decide, how they're going to query their information, and they're able to send their code into the platform, who can then review it. And this is, sorry, I skipped a step. The platform first decides what mock or fake information can be downloaded, and then the researcher facilitates what code they want to send in. Now, here's the interesting thing: the naive version of this is. And I don't know how familiar everyone here is with data science, but we could talk about the same thing with an Excel spreadsheet. So imagine if you had a bunch of private data in Excel and an external researcher wanted to do something with it. So you take your private data in Excel and you scramble all the numbers, but it still has the same columns and structures and formulas and all this kind of stuff. And you send that to an external researcher. You have already revealed some information when you did that, right? You revealed the structure of the problem, this kind of thing. But, and so like things like AI platforms will worry about like, revealing our model architecture or something like this, because it's not the data itself, but it's the way that the data is held, sometimes is intellectual property. So it turns out that like you don't necessarily have to reveal, say, every Excel formula or every part of an AI model when creating legitimate mock information. They just need to have enough mock structure in what you share with them to write their code against it, if that makes sense. Inversely, when the external researcher shares their data with or shares their query with the platform, you might be wondering, oh no, well, one, is the platform just going to say no because they don't want to say yes, this kind of thing? Or second, is the researcher uncomfortable with revealing so much about their methodology? There are two responses to that. So on the first problem of like the researcher revealing too much about their methodology, there are a set of algorithms that can also be used. And this is another privacy-enhancing technology. Things like homomorphic encryption, secure enclaves that we actually showed a second ago can also facilitate this, where the external researcher decides what of their research project they also want to reveal, if that makes sense. So for example, if they had a test data set that they didn't want to reveal, they can use an enclave to hide that test data set, right? If they even have some of the code they want to not reveal. We haven't done this in this specific pilot, but they can choose which parts of their code they want to reveal. And this becomes a kind of a two-way debate on like, what do we really have to show to each other to feel comfortable that we're kind of aligned on values of what this project would be. And this gets to the heart of the issue of the question you asked, Helen, which is like, are platforms going to say yes to individual projects, or are they just going to say no all the time? And I think the best way for me to describe that is that historically, and if you talk to everyone from like Senate staffers to whistleblowers like Frances Haugen to folks in the Christchurch coalition, like a lot of people in the coalition, but they'll tell you that, and even people on online platforms, the most common reason that projects were denied was privacy, security, and intellectual property risk. Not the question is not a good question to answer. And I would say, if an online platform is saying no to a very specific question, that some people feel should be answered and other people feel shouldn't be answered, and privacy, security, and intellectual property is no longer a concern, you have a much more coherent conversation to say, should that question be asked? Because when the data scientist sends in their code, they're not just saying, hey, we should answer this question about whether children are being harmed or whatever the case might be in a high level. They're saying we should answer it in this very, very specific way, right? Can we answer this very specific way? And just makes the conversation between, say, external folks who are applying some type of pressure, internal folks who are building platforms, a lot more coherent around the specific harm that's trying to be mitigated, as opposed to these like other stuff that is not what anyone is. No one's there to try to leak IP and all this kind of stuff. So it just makes the conversation a lot clearer.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Jobs easier.
That makes a lot of sense. And it also sounds like this is the kind of thing that there will need to be debate around, as these technologies get scaled up and adopted more widely, and you're spending less time in that, as you said, that sort of first approval process of very manual. It's the platform for the first time saying like, how does this work? Are we sure this works? Are we sure we're comfortable? As it becomes more routine, then hopefully it would become, the kind of thing that researchers could perhaps talk about publicly. If they're like, here's a bunch of questions, we tried to run through this process and we couldn't get answered. And so that becomes a little bit of a negotiation. That makes sense. Okay, let's see. Getting to a particular application, we have a question about healthcare, and in a country that has a national healthcare system, could this technology allow researchers to analyze the data in that healthcare system without copying the data or without having access to kind of sensitive private information?
Yeah, so there's nothing about this. This is as general as data science tools are. The Python we showed you today was based in Python, so I guess that'd be one constraint. But I'd say the main constraint on the system in its current R&D state is that I don't think we've not done a production deployment with more than like 100 million rows of data, but that we launch things on Kubernetes clusters, which are arbitrarily scalable to lots of different, to large clusters of nodes. And again, the same paradigm of like, as long as the people inside the organization, in this case, in the healthcare network, can create a fake or pretend version of their data sets that can be shared, then external researchers can propose code against those fake or pretend versions that articulate specifically what types of questions they have. So yeah, I see no reason why public health could not also embrace this for facilitating research on health data. Great.
And then getting back to sort of the nitty-gritty here, like how does this work on the back end? Though I'm staying at a high level because most of us, including me, are not in the deep in the technical weeds here. Are there currently any guarantees that so when an AI developer loads a model or a data set into the data site, are there currently any guarantees that that is the same one that is being served to users? Or if there are not right now, is that something that could be built in the future?
We've got some real experts on the call today. So when I said that privacy-enhancing technologies is a combination of different things, this is exactly what I was talking about. So differential privacy is protecting a certain degree of privacy. You need a different type of pet to verify you're getting the asset that you think that you're getting. And our philosophy around this is called structured transparency. I'll share the link to the paper if in a moment, or if someone wants to help out with that, that'd be great. There are a handful of different technologies that can be used in this system to do what you just described. One of them is a hardware-based thing. So the enclaves that we just showed you, the enclave does two things. It provides confidentiality and it provides a signed hash of the computation and the assets that are being run. So you can get a sort of evidence that what was loaded into the system was the same thing that you thought was loaded. And the same thing across multiple projects, all those kinds of things. And it's not just the model itself, but also all the pre-compute code, the stuff that's, these kind of filters and training ETL and all this kind of stuff. Like if any of that changes, the hashes don't match and something has changed and something is different, if that makes sense. So enclaves can do that. And this is already shipped in NVIDIA's H100. Well, it's shipped, the base parts are shipped in H100, but they're still finishing, I think, kind of the drivers and some of the last mile software. But it's enough for us to do tests and demos, but the official generally available version is not yet out. There's also an offline version of this is algorithmic based, which is called zero knowledge proof. So if you've come across zero knowledge proofs before, this is the kind of software algorithmic equivalent where like I can send you a program and because of the nature of the program, it can prove to me that you're providing responses back on the same assets as you did last time, if that makes sense. That does open one other additional question, which you might be wondering about, which is like, how do you know that you're auditing the same platform as the one that's actually in production? That would require the models that are in production also running either on a GPU enclave or with a zero knowledge proof. I would say that is very likely to be a future that we would want to live in, because otherwise, it's difficult to know whether what you're auditing is the same as what's in production or difficult to verify. It seems like there's been several academic papers published lately that are kind of casting that type of future. We also have a blog post on this called How to Audit an AI Model Owned by Someone Else. We can probably share a link to that as well. It talks a little bit about that.
Yeah, great. So it sounds like the short answer is, very much technically feasible, and then
yes. Sorry. Yeah. I probably could have gone shorter on that.
No. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm understanding and crystallizing.
I would say technically feasible, but like we're like just shy of like real production systems that can do it at scale, if that makes sense. So like I would say the theory is, I don't want to use the word solved, but like it's like very stable and has been used, and these systems have been used, but like doing it on like a multi-terabyte, large language model at crazy scale and all this kind of stuff is still an engineering project that needs to be glued together. And also, can that be combined with differential privacy and other types of tools that we were talking about a second ago? That's sort of the state of the tech at the moment.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Okay, I want to turn back to what we sort of started with around, or not started, but the question around kind of who is making these decisions, who is making these approval things, and just kind of dig into that a little bit more since we're getting kind of lots of interest in that from the audience. So can you say a little more about, perhaps in the pilots that you've run so far, what it has looked like for those approvals to go through? Has it just been about like, does this tech, work the way that we think it works? Or has there also been, anything around like, oh, we're not really comfortable with this question, or, oh, this might make us look bad? Have you seen anything like that so far? And then also, how do you think about what it looks like for that to go well in the future of, is this something where researchers should just be, going to the press if they're not getting their questions answered? Or is it something where you think that can happen entirely in dialogue between the researchers and the companies? Or how do you think about kind of that, I guess, that negotiation dynamic looking ideally?
Yeah, so I shouldn't get into specifics in part because as infrastructure providers, it's like really, really important that we maintain a high level of trust with everyone that we're participating in that conversation, in the sense of, it's really important that we're kind of friends with and can work collaboratively with people on both sides of this interaction. But I can point to some high level trends where people are doing really, really innovative work on this question. So I would say that the two that we've worked with that we're most excited about, we worked with more or less seriousness. Reddit is doing some really, really exciting stuff. I would go ahead and check out the posts that that we've announced with Reddit and that Reddit has announced around their use of this software. They have some really, really interesting ideas for how the Reddit community itself can participate in the project approval process. That's like quite interesting. And I expect there'll be more announced there in the future where and there are some, conceptually, there's some cost savings aspect there where if you can offload, if any organization can offload the triaging process to folks external to the firm, that can be nice for helping scale. And then I think that also has like a sort of certain democratic flair to it that's kind of nice. So we'll be looking to see how that project evolves. And then the other place that I would look at that is extremely innovative thought work in this area is the DSA in Europe, where
can you say a little bit about this for our Europe, for us, US focused policy nerds?
Oh, right. So the Digital Services Act passed an article called Article 40, which articulates a process that is still being formalized through which external researchers could propose sort of any project to work with very large online platforms or VLOPs. And it's a legal apparatus through which the regulatory agencies can through this process, if you get all the way to the end and there's various appeals and all this kind of stuff, it can have legal teeth to advocate for specific projects. But what this does, it's a bit of a complicated process, but it involves lots of people being involved in the project approval and queuing process. And a big part of that is what I think the term they use is metadata. I'm trying to remember the exact phrase, but they also are embracing this a very analogous paradigm to what I described a second ago, that there is a high degree of descriptive information about what the internal systems and schemas are, the rows and columns and all this kind of stuff, that allow an external researcher to craft and propose a project before they have access. And then that very detailed, that very detailed description of the project is what gets passed around to the commissioner, the digital services coordinator in Ireland or in Germany or whatever the case might be, or to independent researchers in Brussels as a part of this review process before it goes for final approval with the platforms. I'm butchering some of the process there, so don't quote me exactly on that. But yeah, really, really innovative work. Definitely watch, if you're interested in that question, watch the type of work that Reddit is doing and watch the type of work that the DSA is doing in Europe.
Yeah, great. And then I guess kind of flipping that, those are some questions about, how do you know that the company is playing ball? Are they cooperating, being good actors? Also getting a couple of questions about essentially the flip side of, are there ways that researchers could use this kind of access to reverse engineer the data, to decrypt it somehow, to query a bunch of times and get some kind of get access to something private? How does that work?
Yeah. So again, in the ingredients of pets that exist, this is a great example of where there's been fantastic work over a long period of time on this problem. Differential privacy is the biggest body of work that's helping to avert that. So differential privacy exists to make it to answer this question of when you receive the outputs of a query, can you eventually use enough of those outputs to start reconstructing information from the inputs? I don't know if we have time for me to go into kind of the intuitive description for how differential privacy works, but the key term that I would remind you to remember and to Google for is called a privacy budget. So a privacy budget limits algorithmically the reconstruction risk to very, very small probabilities. I think like 0.0001, whatever, for specific people in your data set. So think if you wanted to make sure that medical patients or whatever the case might be had an extremely, extremely low possibility that someone can reconstruct via these different things, differential privacy can help you out with that. And the big challenge of differential privacy right now is going from systems that are kind of academic in nature and that are assuming a very ideal engineering setup, if that makes sense, to kind of the messier setups that happen in practice with real online platforms, and trying to translate differential privacy, privacy budget into real world harms and these kinds of things. And again, I would say that the theory there is very, very robust. The engineering is still making its way. So, check out projects like OpenDP, which we work with closely and are very excited about.
Great. Jumping to a kind of international lens here, we're seeing a lot of different rules cropping up in different countries around things like data localization, data sharing. How does that interact with these kinds of setup? Is that a big barrier to this working? Does this help mitigate issues of data localization? How do you think about the role of this kind of infrastructure there?
So if I can do the technologist thing and risk being overly optimistic about technology's influence in the world, I would say that particular question is the one I'm most optimistic about, because this type of infrastructure has a radical, if it generalizes in all the ways that we hope for it to, it has the potential to have a very significant change in the incentives and risks for how information is used. So in particular, on the risk side, often when people talk about centralizing data across international boundaries, it's because there's some problem they can't solve unless they put all the data in one place, right? And we work closely with the UN and the UN Statistics Division, who often faces this problem as they're trying to corral and facilitate important actors coming together to answer important questions with data. And I think what they're finding and what we have a few reports out now with our work with the UN that organizations are excited to keep their data local because it means they know that they maintain agency and control over that type of information. The outstanding question that's still being interpreted in various, I think, bills and proposals in a few different agencies in Europe and the United States is what does it mean when the data doesn't technically stay local, but governance does? Because these enclaves, they're kind of funny in that way. We're like, you are copying data into the enclave, but the enclave is like maintaining control for you in like a very tangible, hard, physical way. And so what does that mean when previous legislation has been written focused on where is the copy of the data, which is the right foothold for a very, very long time, right? Up until I think now, right? Until input privacy technology has become mature. And so there is a little bit of like regulatory catch up to that kind of new paradigm that needs to happen. And the only other thing that I would mention is that this infrastructure, if people don't have to give away a copy of their data in order to allow other people to use it, that's a pretty big incentive change for data markets in general, which is, if I had to make money by selling a copy of my data, every customer becomes a competitor for the future use and sale of that data. It's like a thing where the supply is always amplifying towards infinity. And this type of infrastructure has the potential to flip that incentive, where people who previously might have been sharing copies of data would have an incentive, a moral incentive, a political incentive, and an economic incentive to maintain control over the only copy of that information. And that's a big hammer to change. And it's unclear, what types of effects that might have, but I think they're largely positive, especially for folks who are interested in kind of digital sovereignty.
Yeah, great. And that's a great segue to another question we had come in, which was about potential regulatory barriers or regulatory opportunities or things in that space. So what I'm hearing you say is, there's this whole data localization paradigm that has kind of been built up on the basis of some assumptions about how sharing data or, access to data works that may actually not be as true in the future. Are there other big examples that come to mind for you of sort of on the regulatory side, regulations that are in place that are problematic or that people are considering that you think, maybe don't account for this technology? And then, would also be interested in the answer, the sort of technical side of this in terms of any technical barriers or technical sort of next steps.
Yeah, so it's probably very dangerous for me to comment on laws to the audience here because I am a lowly technologist who's trying to help as best we can. But I'm sure there are some legal scholars here that would know a lot about these types of issues. I would say the main theme is that this type of infrastructure really changes what it means to control information. Previously, controlling information meant keeping the only copy, like the open versus closed source debate, for example. Like, open source models, anyone can do anything they want with any open source model, right? Including all the benefits and all the harms and all this kind of stuff. Closed source model, only one organization can control what that model is used for. And that's like that's a all or nothing kind of tension. And this type of infrastructure says, oh, wait, we can have like a pluralist kind of collective governance that's actually enforceable by collectives that like opens up this whole new play space for not having to centralize data across borders, for not having to centralize data in lots of different contexts, or the opposite, radically decentralize data by making it totally open for absolutely everyone. We can explore whether in some use cases, I mean, I'm not saying this is true for all things. Some data should just be open. I love Wikipedia. Wikipedia is great. But there is probably some classes of data where these two extremes just aren't the ideal extremes anymore. And this type of infrastructure could allow us to explore middle grounds of collective control. And this is where though I'm so excited about the type of the work that DSA is doing or that the Reddit is exploring, and folks at the the UN Statistics Division, the US Census Bureau, because they're exploring this middle ground and laying the crazy important precedents for how the future digital infrastructure could work in general in these specific use cases. But the applications are really, really exciting. Well, now I really sound like a technologist, but here we go.
So we have you here. We need to get stuck in our doom and gloom here in Washington. We need to bring people in from, I guess you're not based in on the West Coast, but we need to bring in the technology, more optimistic perspective, which I think is really, really warranted here. This is actually genuinely unlocking new things that you could not do without sort of these technological approaches. But that was also a good, I think, we're over an hour here. I think if we tried to get to all the great questions we have, we could go for another hour. But starting to move towards wrapping up, you've talked today about some of the specific, projects that you're working on that are, in many cases at the sort of proof of concept stage of making sure that everything works the way it's intended, and really valuable work, not just showing that the technical side works, but also that on the legal side, on the organizational side, the sort of bureaucratic negotiation side, it can all work. What do you think? How do you think about the next steps from here? Are you more focused on showing additional pilots of additional potential use cases, or is it more about scaling up what you've done from here? Is that something OpenMined should work on, or is that something for other organizations? What do you think about now that there are starting to be these really, really interesting, cool proofs of concept? What kind of comes next?
That is a great question. So the vision of impact here really, it's not enough for a small handful of pilots to they can show a template for how things could work, but I think we are very ambitiously advocating that I think the title slide to our website at the moment is that we can inspire all data owners to make their data available for study, right? And that inspiration could come from, the value they could create, the citations that they could receive, if they're academics, or the, I suppose if in the private sector, even commercial revenue on the opportunity side. And our big mission and our hope is that ultimately the layers that connect all these different people would be freely available, open public infrastructure. Things, modern analogies to www and HTTP and TCP and all these types of things, as opposed to things that would be kind of like yet another walled garden, if that makes sense. So from our perspective, the main thing that we're trying to do is now lower the barrier to entry to adopting these types of things through documentation, more community engagement, and working with public sector support to try to facilitate, to answer this question, like how does this kind of new sort of internet for non-public information come together, where many or most of the world's organizations and maybe even individuals can participate. And that's a big grand vision that requires lots of questions to be answered, and probably some public sector support, either regulatory support or funding support, not just for players like us, but really for the whole ecosystem of companies, government agencies, nonprofits, academic institutions that would need to change infrastructure to adopt this type of technology. So our job is to try to make it freely available and easy to use by integrating lots of other people's great work. I mentioned OpenDP, but there are many other privacy-enhanced technology providers. And so I think what's next is hopefully a big wave of new information, adding clarity on some of the biggest questions of our time, but in a way that upholds democratic values and doesn't require centralizing copies to one big place or releasing all information out into the open, but this kind of messy in between that allows us to have interesting forms of governance. So, yeah. Oh, I think you're muted.
Fantastic. I think there's a ton more to do. I hope that part of what is needed here, I think, is helping people understand that this is possible, what is possible, how it works, what it can do, what it can't do. So I'm excited that we were able to share some of that today. I think I believe you maybe have some more blog posts and announcements coming out over the next few weeks and months with more information about what you've been working on. I'm hoping that we at CSET can also put out some written work or some blog posts and things explaining some of this stuff more. So I'm very excited about that. Okay, I think we should probably move towards wrapping up. Hopefully folks have seen in the chat. Irina, thanks so much for adding in some of those resources for people who are interested in learning more about OpenMind's work. There's a blog post there about the sort of approach to auditing in a little bit more of a hands-on way, and then a great paper about sort of the higher level concepts of structured transparency, which are both really great resources for people wanting to learn more. Of course, they can go to OpenMind's website and also look at other things. Look at the event page, and we'll have this video up to refer back to as well. I think with that, we can start to close. I really want to thank everyone for joining us and for your fantastic questions, and to Andrew and Irina for a very lively discussion, and really cool to see the actual back end of how this all works as well. I wish we could have gotten to everyone's questions, but time was short and the questions were many and interesting. We'll follow up soon from CSET with details of our next event, and in the meantime, you can sign up for additional updates and learn more about CSET at cset.georgetown.edu. We hope you all have a great day, and we will plan to see you next time.